Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard here, welcome back to the channel. Today we'll have a look at this new Laowa 58mm f2.8 2x macro lens. Yes, another macro lens from Laowa. This guy seems to release new macro lens faster than I can review them. So as usual in this video, we'll have a look at the design, image quality, and I'll also share with you some of the photos that I shot with this lens. Before we start the review, I want to talk about something first. I want to talk about the focal length for macro lens, and the reason is I feel like I have reviewed quite a lot of macro lenses from Laowa, so that got me to think, well, do we really need so many different macro lenses? I had a look at my camera lens cabinet, and I actually have quite a few macro lenses myself. Just for my full frame cameras, I have a 60mm Nikon macro lens, a Laowa 100mm macro lens, and I recently bought a Laowa 24mm periprobe macro lens as well. And these are just the full frame macro lenses that I bought myself, and I have many more macro lenses for my APS-C and Micro Four Thirds cameras. So why do I have so many macro lenses? Isn't that they're all pretty much the same? Well, the answer is probably not. So unless you are mainly just using your macro lens to take photos of, say, your film negative or anything that is pretty static and 2D, different focal length would make a huge difference to how your macro photos is gonna look like. Let me show you an example. Here are 3 different macro photos. The subject is my minifigure, and the minifigure is pretty much the same size in all these 3 photos. One of the photos I shot with my Laowa 100mm macro lens, and one with this Laowa 58mm macro lens, and one with my Laowa 24mm probe macro lens. So even though the size of the subject is pretty much the same, the photos look very different. The photo shot with the 100mm macro lens, you don't really see too much background at all. It's like you are viewing something through a telescope. The opposite is the photo that's shot with the 24mm periprobe lens. The field of view is much wider. It's almost like you are an insect and you crawl into that scene, and that's how you will see from your eyes. And that's probably why Laowa say the probe lens has the bird's eye perspective. And for the 58mm lens, it's somewhere in between. So there's no better or worse perspective, it's just how you want your photo to look like. Do you want your macro photo to tell a story about your subject in its surrounding area? Or you want to minimize the distraction from the background and get the viewer to focus on your subject? Or maybe somewhere in between. And it's not just the background. Your main subject would also look quite different too. In the photo, depends on the focal length of the lens that you use. Another important thing for choosing the focal length is the working distance between the front of the lens and your subject. A longer focal length macro lens usually allow you to have longer working distance, which means the distance between your subject and the front of the lens when you're taking macro photos, while wide-angle macro lens usually means there is not much working distance at all, so your front of the lens will be very close to your subject. So a longer focal length is usually better if you want to take photos of, say, insects or anything that will move away if you get a little bit too close to it. And one more thing you should consider is the depth of field. When doing normal non-macro photos, we would quite often want to have more shallow depth of field so that you can separate the subject from your background. But when you are doing macro photography, because your distance to your subject is so close, you will have very shallow depth of field. So you quite often would actually struggle to get enough depth of field to keep your entire subject in focus. And that's why a lot of macro photographers has to rely on techniques like stack focusing, which you take dozens or even hundreds of photos at different focus points and then blend them together during post-processing to give you more depth of field. The super shallow depth of field problem is usually the worst when you are shooting with a longer focal length macro lens. If you look at my 3 sample photos again, they were all shot with the same aperture setting, and you can see the difference in the depth of field. So choosing a macro lens is not really that easy. There are just lots of things that you have to consider, and that's not a best or worst focal length, and that's why I have so many macro lens myself, because each focal length has its own pros and cons and give the photo a different kind of look. So we should really think about what do we want to shoot, how do we want our photo to look like, and understand what are the technical challenges that we would have, and then choose the macro lens with the most suitable focal length. But if you haven't really done much macro photography before and not too sure what works the best for you, I found that around 60mm for a full frame camera is always a good middle ground that is suitable for a good range of macro photography. So now we all have a better idea how to choose a macro lens. Let's continue the review of this new Laowa 58mm 2x macro lens. Okay, now let's have a look at the design and operation of this Laowa 58mm macro lens. This macro lens is designed for full-frame mirrorless cameras, and it is available for Sony E, Nikon Z, Canon RF, and Leica L mount. But of course, you can use it on the APS-C cameras for one of these mounts as well. The sample that I received from Laowa is for the Leica L mount, but optically they are all identical. So my image quality test results should be pretty much the same as the version for other mounts. Just like most other Laowa lenses, this 58mm f2.8 2x macro lens is a fully mechanical, fully manual lens. There's no electronic features of any sort, and there's no electronic contacts to transfer the lens information to your camera. So if your camera has an in-body image stabilizer, make sure you set up the focal length correctly on the camera yourself. The lens has a really solid metal construction. Apart from the lens hood and the lens cap, which are made of plastic, everything else is metal. The build quality is the usual high quality Laowa standard. The weight of the lens is around 600 grams, so it's not a lightweight lens at all. The lens comes with a plastic reversible lens hood, and it has a 67mm front filter thread. Focus ring is pretty big, about 3/4 of the lens is the manual focus ring. The focus throw is approximately 180 degrees, which is definitely needed for a 2x macro lens to give you precise focus control. The focus ring feels pretty smooth. The focus scale tells you the focus distance in meter and feet, and I like it that it also tells you the magnification ratio as well. We have the aperture ring near the lens mount. It has clicks and 1 stop per click, and the clicks feels very nice. One thing that makes Laowa a very interesting optics company is that apart from their ultra wide angle 15mm macro lens, every single one of their macro lens is 2x macro or even higher magnification, and they can all focus to infinity. So this 58mm macro lens is also a 2x macro lens and also can focus to infinity. I really like it as it allows people to enjoy macro photography that is higher than 1x magnification without having to buy a separate specialized ultra macro only lens. The minimum focus distance of this macro lens is 18.5 cm when you want to take photo at 2x magnification, and that is the distance measured from the sensor to the subject. So the actual distance between the front of the lens and the subject, which is the working distance, is only around 5 cm, so it is not really a lot. If you take 1x macro photo, the working distance is now increased to around 7 cm or so, so you will have a little bit more distance between the front of the lens and your subject. One nice thing about this macro lens is that it is an internal focus lens, which means the length of the lens wouldn't change when you adjust the focus, so you don't have to worry about your lens may suddenly extend and touch or even knock down your subject when you are taking macro photos and adjusting focus. Okay, let's have a look at the image quality now, and as usual, we will start with the image sharpness. If we look at the center of the photo, at the maximum aperture f2.8, the center sharpness is already excellent. You may see a little bit of color in the test chart, but it's not color fringing. It's actually the artifact caused by anti-aliasing, because the Panasonic S5 that I use doesn't have any anti-aliasing filter on the sensor. So when you take a photo of something that has lots of really fine details and your lens is very sharp, you may sometimes see this kind of anti-aliasing artifact. And since the center sharpness of the lens is excellent at f2.8 already, so when I stop down the lens, the center sharpness is pretty much the same until we reach f16, then the diffraction makes the center slightly softer. Okay, now let's have a look at the corner of the photo. At f2.8, the sharpness is okay. I wouldn't say it is very sharp, but I definitely wouldn't say it's soft as well. Focus at the corner instead of the center only improve the corner sharpness a little bit, which suggests the lens has very minimal field curvature. The corner sharpness would gradually improve as we stop down the lens. The maximum sharpness is at around f11 if you focus at the corner, or f16 if you focus at the center. And now let's have a look at the image sharpness when taking macro photo at one-time magnification. At f2.8, the center of the photo is pretty sharp already. At f4, the center sharpness now becomes excellent, and the sharpness remains excellent until f11. After that, the image becomes softer as you stop down the lens further. And at 2x magnification, the center sharpness at f2.8 is good. I think the biggest problem when shooting at f2.8 is actually trying to nail the focus because the depth of field is extremely shallow. Stop down to f4 and the sharpness will improve a bit. Maximum sharpness is at around f5.6 to f8. From f11 onwards, the sharpness was starting to drop and it becomes quite a bit softer when you stop down to the minimum aperture f22. To allow the lens to have round circular bokeh even when stop down the lens, this Laowa macro lens has a 13 aperture braid design. Because of that, the bokeh is indeed very round even when we stop down the lens. Even at f22, the bokeh is still very round. There isn't any serious cat's-eye swirly bokeh effect when shooting at the maximum aperture, and overall the bokeh is just very smooth and it dissolves the background beautifully and doesn't look nervous at all. So if you love to have very nice and smooth background bokeh, this Laowa macro lens would be a very good choice. Let's have a look at vignetting now. At f2.8, vignetting is noticeable but at pretty reasonable level, and it improves gradually as we stop down the lens. At f8, there is only very small amount of vignetting, but if you continue to stop down the lens, then you could further reduce the amount of light fall off near the corner of the photo. Laowa called this lens an APO or APO lens, and that means the lens should have very minimal amount of chromatic aberration. And when I look at all my photos, even those that were shot with very high contrast, indeed I see virtually no chromatic aberration at all. Even my test photos that has really high contrast, I see virtually no color fringing. And let's have a look at some local test photos. I also see no purple or green color fringing in both the foreground and background area, so that is also very impressive. In terms of lens flare, let's look at some of the test video that I shot on a bright sunny day. Overall, lens flare control is acceptable. Contrast remains pretty good, and I also don't see too much ghosting as well. However, when shooting at some certain angle, that is usually when the sun is just outside the frame, then there would be a bit of lens flare, which caused the contrast to drop a bit as well. Unfortunately, the provided lens hood doesn't really help improve this issue much. But this issue doesn't really happen very easily, so it is not really a big problem when you are shooting real-world photos. Okay, now let's look at distortion. So it's time to look at some brick wall test photos again. Look at this photo. I would say this Laowa 58mm macro lens has very minimal amount of distortion. Now, given that this is a fully mechanical lens, so Laowa cannot rely on any software correction to correct any kind of distortion, so it definitely gets a big thumbs up from me in this area. Wide-angle Laowa lenses usually renders some of the most beautiful 10-point Sunstars, and it's because they have a 5 aperture braid design that is primarily optimized for beautiful Sunstars. However, for macro lenses, bokeh is very important and more important than Sunstars. So for this Laowa 58mm lens, the Sunstars looks pretty average even when I stop down the lens to the minimum aperture f22. The Sunstars just doesn't look very nice to me at all no matter what aperture setting that I use. This 58mm macro lens has quite a bit of focus briefing. If we look at this test footage, I was shooting at f8 and I changed the focus distance from 1 meter to infinity. You can see the focus briefing quite easily, but this is pretty much the same as most other macro lenses that I have reviewed, so it's not really any worse than those other macro lenses. After reviewing so many Laowa lenses, I kind of know what I should expect when Laowa release another macro lens. Good solid build quality, excellent sharpness, very low chromatic aberration, and 2x magnification. And this is exactly what this 58mm 2x macro lens is. There really isn't much that I can complain about this lens. Maybe Laowa can improve the coating and minimize the lens flare a little bit, but to be fair, the lens flare performance isn't terrible at all. Or maybe I can complain about the weight of the lens as it is around 600 grams. So while the size of the lens is pretty alright, it definitely is not a lightweight lens at all. But yes, these are pretty much the only negative things about this Laowa macro lens. 58mm focal length is not too wide or too long, so it is quite a versatile focal length that you could use it to shoot a bit of everything. It's not too hard to use compared to macro lens that has a much longer or much wider focal length. If you are thinking of getting your first macro lens, this 58mm 2x macro lens is definitely quite a good choice for you. But if you prefer to have a lighter macro lens so that maybe you can bring it with you when you go out to do some hiking, then you should check out my review of the Laowa 85mm f5.6 lens. It is also a 2x macro lens for full frame camera with really good image quality, but it is quite a bit smaller and also only weighs around 300 grams.